Welcome to Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
Episode 30. Let's get into it.
This week, the world produced a lot of surface noise and a few genuinely important signals underneath it. A war that's quietly reshaping the entire geopolitical architecture of South Asia. A metal most people have never heard of, whose exports to Japan just hit exactly zero. Scientists on Mars who found something that's been waiting 3.5 billion years to be discovered. And a room full of central bankers in Washington that fractured in a way the institution hasn't seen since 1992. In What You Didn't See in the News, we'll run through the stories that didn't make the top of the feed, but probably should have. Wake Up Ready covers a heavy week. Jobs data Friday, earnings from Palantir, AMD, and Disney, and the quiet opening act of the most consequential Fed leadership transition since Greenspan. We've got your knowledge bomb on why slang isn't lazy language. It's a compression algorithm with social teeth. A Humor Me segment about the surprisingly sophisticated taxonomy of money's many nicknames. And a greater debate between two economists who are fundamentally arguing over whether the state is the platform markets run on or the interference pattern that keeps them from working. Then we close with Let's Invent Again and the story of a man who built the hardware layer that every human voice now travels through, who invented something in 90% of 2 billion devices made annually, and who had to fight every institution around him just to stay in the room where he did it.
A lot of signal this week, hidden in a lot of noise. That's the episode.
Let's go.
Each week, we explore ideas that help you pause, reflect, and think more deeply about the opportunities all around you.
It's the perfect mix. A little information, a few stats, some real-world insights, and just enough deep talk to make you feel smarter before your second cup of coffee. A quick thank you to our sponsor, agentweekly.ai, chronicling the absurd, the ambitious, and the algorithmically challenged corners of the AI agent economy. The IMF just told us something it's rarely willing to say in a formal publication. The world is in trouble, and the math is getting worse. In its April 2026 World Economic Outlook, titled bluntly, Global Economy in the Shadow of War, the fund cut its global growth forecast to 3.1% for this year. That's down from a pre-conflict estimate of 3.4%. And the 3.1 number assumes the Middle East conflict stays contained, that energy prices only spike around 19%, and that Iran and the United States find some kind of framework before the Strait of Hormuz situation becomes permanent. None of those assumptions look especially solid right now. Here's what that 3.1% actually means in practice. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas. When Iranian forces effectively closed it on March 4th, it didn't just spike energy prices. It exposed the degree to which the global economy is still a single thread tied to a very specific waterway. The IMF's adverse scenario, where energy disruptions persist and inflation expectations slip, drops global growth to 2.5%. Their severe scenario, energy dislocations extending into 2027 with real financial tightening, takes growth to 2%. For context, 2% global GDP growth is the technical threshold for a global recession. The second-order story is about inflation dynamics. The IMF is projecting headline global inflation at 4.4% in the base case and above 6% in the severe case. That matters because it resets the calculus for every central bank that had been pivoting toward easing. When oil is structurally disrupted, rate cuts don't become easier, they become political. And the distinction between mathematical justification and political permission for a cut is exactly where central bank credibility lives. Why it surfaced this week specifically? The IMF spring meetings took place on April 14th in Washington. The formal release included the phrase, major energy crisis, not in background commentary in the official document. When the IMF uses that phrase in a published WEO, it's a signal worth taking seriously, regardless of where headline oil is trading that morning.
The severe scenario isn't just a number. It's a policy trap. Because the same war that's crushing growth is also preventing the rate cuts that would cushion it.
That same geopolitical disruption is producing winners as well as losers. And one of the week's most underreported stories is about a country that's turned regional conflict into a global diplomatic credential. A year ago, Pakistan was a country at war with India. Today, it's the most important diplomatic intermediary on the planet. Field Marshal Asim Munir, promoted to that rank specifically for his conduct in the 2025 India-Pakistan conflict, hosted the Islamabad talks on April 11th and 12th, a 21-hour negotiation between the United States and Iran aimed at resolving the Hormuz crisis. The talks lasted 3 rounds. They ended without a deal. Iran and the U.S. left without agreement on the nuclear program or the status of the strait. But the fact that they happened in Islamabad, not Geneva, not Doha, not Brussels, says everything about how fast the geopolitical hierarchy can shift when the right combination of relationships and credibility exists in a specific place. Here's the texture that makes this more than just diplomacy news. Trump has publicly called Munir his favorite field marshal. That's not flattery. It reflects a strategic calculation that Pakistan has diplomatic access to Tehran, the U.S. doesn't. Enough proximity to China to be genuinely neutral, and a demonstrated ability to manage nuclear-adjacent military escalation without triggering exchange. That combination of credentials is extremely rare right now. Analysts at CFR are describing this as the first time in decades that Pakistan has been viewed as a primary international player rather than a secondary one. The economic footprint follows the diplomacy. Pakistan's GDP growth estimates are being revised upward in models that account for post-conflict reconstruction and trade corridor realignment as the country positions itself as a regional hub. The second-order infrastructure play, whoever is building Pakistan's physical and digital logistics network over the next decade, is a longer duration bet than most people are making. The attention reason this week is specific. Iran's foreign minister left Islamabad on April 26th and flew directly to Moscow to triangulate a new proposal through Russia. The shuttle diplomacy is still live, and Pakistan is the venue every time talks restart.
The country that was exchanging missiles with its neighbor in May 2025 is now the venue for the world's most consequential peace talks. Pakistan didn't just survive that conflict, it cashed a very specific geopolitical chip from it.
Which brings us to a story that connects directly to that same geopolitical repositioning, but plays out in a much smaller unit of measure. Gallium exports from China to Japan in the first 2 months of 2026 were exactly 0 kilograms. Not low, not down, 0, compared to more than 8,000 kilograms in the same period of 2025. Germanium, critical for fiber optics and next-generation chips, also 0, down from 400 kilograms a year ago. China controls roughly 99% of the world's gallium supply. It imposed new state-controlled export licensing requirements on dual-use critical minerals, materials with both civilian and military applications, covering Japan in early January, following public statements from Japan's Minister Sanae Takaichi regarding regional security and Taiwan. The mechanism isn't a ban in the traditional legal sense. It's a licensing regime. You must apply for permission to export, and China simply doesn't approve the applications. For Japan, the distinction matters because it means there's no formal violation of any trade agreement to challenge and no explicit timeline for reversal. The texture. Gallium isn't obscure. It's in compound semiconductors used in 5G base stations, in radar and defense electronics, in high-frequency chips throughout consumer technology. Japan's defense electronics rebuild and 5G infrastructure expansion are both directly downstream of this choke point, and neither has a meaningful alternative supply buffer. The broader implication for everyone watching, the same licensing mechanism that hit Japan to 0 is still in place globally. China just hasn't activated it for other destinations yet. That's not a resolved situation. It's a latent one. The attention reason this week is the March bilateral trade data published in late April by Japan's Ministry of Finance, which confirmed the 0 figures for the first 2 months of the year. Small companies in gallium recovery and alternative sourcing have shown unusual volume acceleration on OTC markets in the past 2 weeks.
China doesn't need a tariff to control a supply chain. It just needs a licensing form it doesn't process. That's leverage most people still haven't fully modeled.
Staying in science for a moment, because one of the most genuinely remarkable science stories of the year landed in Nature Communications this week, and it didn't get close to the attention it deserved. The Curiosity rover has been crawling across Gale Crater on Mars for over a decade. This week, scientists published the results of a new kind of experiment. The rover collected a rock sample and dissolved it in a chemical called TMAAH, which unlocks compounds that earlier extraction methods couldn't detect. The result was the most diverse array of organic molecules ever found on Mars. More than 20 compounds in a single sample from clay-bearing sandstone in a region called Knock-Farrell Hill, including 7 that had never been detected on the planet before. One of them has a molecular structure similar to precursors of DNA, a compound never before seen on Mars. Here's the context that makes the numbers meaningful. The rock those molecules came from is approximately 3.5 billion years old. The clay itself indicates the presence of liquid water at some point in Mars's deep past, the kind of water that would have created chemically hospitable conditions, even if not biologically active ones. The organic molecules have been preserved in that rock for 3.5 billion years on a radiation-exposed planet. Whatever process created them was stable enough to survive deep geological time. Scientists are being appropriately careful. These could be from meteorites or from geological chemistry with no biological origin. The paper doesn't claim biosignatures. What it does say is that the methodology, Team H dissolution, opens a new window on Martian chemistry that prior experiments couldn't access. There's more in the rock than earlier instruments could see. The second-order implication is for sample return priorities. If this methodology can be run on Curiosity, future missions with higher resolution instruments are the natural next step. The policy and funding conversation around Mars sample return is about to get considerably more interesting.
We found the ingredients, 3.5 billion years old, sitting there waiting. The question of who left them there is still open.
Staying in physics for a moment, because something published in Nature Communications on April 28th deserves more attention than it got, and the implications are genuinely unusual. Scientists just watched an antimatter atom behave like a wave, for the first time, ever. The atom in question is positronium, one of the rarest objects in physics. It's made of a single electron and a positron, its antimatter counterpart, orbiting each other. The two particles exist together for about 140 nanoseconds before annihilating in a flash of gamma radiation. A team from Tokyo University of Science fired a coherent beam of positronium through graphene sheets and observed a diffraction pattern on the detector. Diffraction is what happens when waves interfere. Positronium produced one. That's the first direct confirmation of wave-particle duality in an antimatter system. Here's the texture of how hard this was to pull off. Positronium carries no electric charge, which means you can't steer it with magnetic fields the way you can with charged particles. The standard toolkit for these experiments doesn't work. The team's solution: generate negatively charged positronium ions, then fire a precisely timed laser pulse to strip the extra electron away, producing a fast-moving, electrically neutral, coherent stream in the nanoseconds before it enters the apparatus. That sequence alone, ions to neutrals, timed in nanoseconds in a controlled beam, is an engineering achievement separate from the physics result. Why it matters. Positronium is the only atom made of both matter and antimatter. Because it's electrically neutral and extremely light, it doesn't interact with the electric fields that complicate other antimatter experiments. That makes it nearly ideal for testing one of the most fundamental open questions in physics. Does antimatter fall toward gravity the same way matter does? Wave interference experiments with positronium could eventually produce the cleanest answer to that question we've ever had. The attention reason is specific. The paper dropped April 28th, and the citation velocity in physics preprint communities was immediate. This had been on the experimental roadmap for roughly 3 years, and the community recognized the result.
The atom that annihilates itself in 140 nanoseconds just confirms something about the structure of reality. That's not a small result.
There's something equally counterintuitive happening underground, but a lot closer to home. Scientists backed by a consortium of European research institutions published results this week of a fuel cell that generates electricity from ordinary soil. No batteries, no solar panels, no external power source. The device works by tapping the metabolic processes of bacteria that live in the top few centimeters of Earth. As those microbes break down organic matter, a continuous process happening in every field, every backyard, every forest floor on the planet, they release small amounts of electrical current. The fuel cell captures that current and channels it to power sensors. The practical application is more significant than it might sound. Consider agricultural fields that need continuous moisture monitoring across thousands of acres. Remote pipeline networks that need underground leak detection without human access. Forest fire early warning systems in regions without reliable electrical infrastructure. All of those require sensors that need power. And right now, that power mostly comes from batteries that have to be replaced, or solar panels that can't penetrate dense ground cover. The soil-powered fuel cell removes that constraint entirely. As long as there's organic matter in the ground, which is essentially everywhere, the sensor runs indefinitely. The second order play is scale. There are hundreds of millions of underground sensors in infrastructure networks globally. The economics of powering them change entirely if the soil is the power source. The paper published in Biosensors and Bioelectronics in late April, but the preprint circulated in European research circles in early March and started accumulating unusual citation velocity the week of April 21st, a strong signal of imminent broader pickup.
We've been generating electricity from coal, gas, and wind for 2 centuries. The ground we walk on was doing it on its own the whole time. We just weren't listening.
Bringing that counterintuitive theme directly into markets. The Federal Reserve's April 29th meeting just produced the highest number of dissenting votes at a single meeting since October 1992. The rate decision itself wasn't the news. The FOMC held steady at 3.5 to 3.75%, matching market expectations. The news was what happened inside the vote. 4 members dissented, 3 hawks and 1 dove. Beth Hammack, Neil Kashkari, and Lori Logan voted to hold rates but explicitly refused to endorse the statement's easing bias. Stephen Moran voted for an immediate 25 basis point cut. Jerome Powell, in what he confirmed was his final press conference as Fed chair, presided over an 8-4 split in an institution that has operated on rough consensus for decades. Here's the texture of why that easing bias dissent matters beyond the headline. The easing bias in an FOMC statement isn't just language. It's a signal to markets about the direction of future policy. When 3 hawks actively refuse to endorse it, they're communicating that they see the statement as premature, that the conditions for easing haven't been met, and they don't want their names attached to language implying they have. That's a structural rift about what the Fed's current mission actually is: managing inflation risk from a war-driven oil shock or managing recession risk from slowing demand. Both positions are defensible. They're not compatible. And the transition. Kevin Warsh, confirmed 13-11 by the Senate Banking Committee on April 29th, takes over May 15th. Powell, unusually, is staying on the Fed board, citing Trump's legal pressure and saying, in his words, "I had no choice." The last time a Fed chair remained on the board after stepping down as chair was decades ago. It doesn't happen in normal transitions.
A 4-dissent meeting and an outgoing chair who says he had no choice but to stay. That's not a routine handoff. That's an institution under visible stress from multiple directions at once.
That stress in financial institutions isn't limited to the Fed. There's a consumer credit paradox running quietly underneath the full employment narrative, and it's worth understanding. U.S. credit card delinquency rates are currently 50% above their pre-pandemic lows. The unemployment rate is 4.3%. Those two facts should not coexist. The historical relationship between employment and credit health is one of the most durable patterns in financial data. When people have jobs, they pay their bills. The current 3.3% delinquency rate on credit cards would have been consistent with an unemployment rate between 5.5 and 6% in prior cycles. It's occurring instead at near full employment. Something structurally different is happening in the consumer credit market. The breakdown tells the story. The widening gap between prime lenders, JP Morgan at 2.3% delinquency, and retail card lenders like Synchrony at 4.8% is the widest spread since 2010. The stress is concentrated in lower prime and retail card borrowers, the 18 to 24-year-old cohort, and middle-income households that expanded credit access during the post-pandemic inflation period and are now servicing balances at 24 to 28% interest rates. These aren't unemployment casualties. They're fully employed Americans who took on variable rate debt when rates were near zero and are now running fast enough to stay in place, but not fast enough to get ahead of the balance. The second-order implication is direct. Consumer discretionary spending in the lower income and young adult segments is the first category to compress when revolving debt service crosses a threshold, not because people lose income, but because available income after minimum payments shrinks. That compression is already visible in transaction data from regional banks, and it's a leading signal for retail earnings in the back half of the year.
Full employment used to be a clean signal. When it stops correlating with credit health, it's telling you the jobs don't pay what the jobs used to pay.
That same tension between the economy's aggregate numbers and the lived experience of specific cohorts is playing out in California in a very public way this week. More than 1.5 million Californians signed a petition to put a one-time 5% tax on billionaires' accumulated wealth on the November ballot. The threshold to qualify was 875,000 signatures. They cleared it by nearly double, and the backers announced the milestone on April 28th. The measure, a combined constitutional amendment and state statute, would apply to residents and former residents with assets over $1 billion, directing the revenue toward healthcare, food assistance, and public education. The word former is doing real policy work in that sentence. It means the tax follows you if you've left the state subject to a residency window, which is exactly why Sergey Brin moved to a $42 million mansion on Nevada's side of Lake Tahoe before the January 1st residency date the measure's architects had flagged. Since January, tech executives and venture capitalists have poured $93 million into a nonprofit called Building a Better California to defeat the measure. Brin alone contributed $57 million. He reportedly confronted Governor Gavin Newsom about the initiative at a private gathering before formally organizing his political spending campaign. The second-order story is the national precedent question. California ballot initiatives are policy laboratories. Prop 13's property tax structure, clean air standards, CCPA privacy regulations. California has set national floors before. If a 5% wealth tax passes in November in the world's fifth largest economy by GDP, the policy conversation in Congress changes, which is why $93 million has been deployed against a state ballot initiative. The math isn't just about California's revenue, it's about what that result says about the national appetite for structural wealth redistribution.
The billionaires moved to Nevada. The signatures kept coming. That gap between where wealth relocates and where political pressure builds is exactly what this fight is actually about.
Shifting to the creator economy, and a deal announced April 22nd that sounds like a press release and is actually a meaningful structural shift in how audio creators get paid. YouTube and SiriusXM Media announced that SiriusXM will serve as the exclusive audio advertising sales representative for YouTube in the United States. That means SiriusXM's ad team, built around guaranteed audio impressions on radio and streaming, will now sell guaranteed audio ad inventory against YouTube's audio-first users. The number SiriusXM cited, 212 million monthly U.S. listeners engaging with YouTube with their screens off, treating the platform essentially like a podcast or music service. Here's what changes for creators. Until now, a podcaster or long-form interview channel on YouTube earned from visual ad impressions, pre-rolls, and mid-rolls designed for eyes. Audio-only listening generated lower revenue because advertisers weren't buying that context. SiriusXM's involvement introduces guaranteed audio CPMs, which is how podcast advertising has always been priced, and which historically outperforms visual CPMs for categories like finance, health, and personal development. The advertisers who buy podcast spots are a different ecosystem from the display advertising world, and they have real budget specifically allocated for audio. The rollout starts fall 2026, not now. The creators positioned to benefit most are those with large listener bases that engage audio first. Finance channels, true crime, news commentary, long-form interview formats. There's a first-mover window here. The creators who build audio-optimized content before the SiriusXM rollout are the ones who'll have the data to negotiate better rates when guaranteed CPMs become available.
212 million people listening to YouTube with their screens off just became an addressable audio audience. That's not a new feature. That's a new market being turned on.
And finally, something that started as a TikTok meme and turned out to have a genuinely interesting explanation underneath it. A video posted by TikToker Hearts Kyra in early April racked up 38 million views in under a week with a simple premise, listing things that prove women don't care about looks. Among the celebrities and abstract concepts on the list was the math equation 7 times 7 equals 49. Not as a joke, exactly, as a sincere inclusion. And the comments made it stranger, thousands of people saying they knew exactly what she meant. Here's the key fact that makes this more than just absurdist internet humor. The neurological phenomenon that kept appearing in the comment threads is called ordinal linguistic personification, a subtype of synesthesia where ordered sequences like numbers, days of the week, or months acquire distinct personalities, genders, or sensory qualities. For people with this trait, which is more common than most people realize, with some estimates putting it at 15 to 20% of the population, the number 7 has a specific character. Commenters described it as having autumnal energy, a Thursday quality, a kind of angular confidence. The equation 7 times 7 equals 49 is, in that perceptual register, an aesthetic statement as specific as any other. Here's the texture of what's actually happening. The trend went viral, not because people found the joke funny, but because enough people had this experience silently and had never seen it named or recognized publicly. The internet didn't create the phenomenon. It created the conditions for a community to discover it existed. Know Your Memes page for it was created the week of April 21st, and the mainstream entertainment press picked it up by the end of the month. This connects directly to the knowledge bomb this week: slang as compression and signaling. The 7 times 7 equals 49 trend is exactly that: a community finding a way to signal a shared perceptual experience through absurdism, because no formal vocabulary existed for it. The signal was always there. The platform just made it legible.
38 million people agreed that a multiplication equation has a particular energy. That's not brain rot. That's a community discovering it exists.
Taking a step back across all of that, 3 patterns. First, the things we assumed we understood keep turning out to have more underneath them. An antimatter atom behaving as a wave. The employment to delinquency correlation breaking down at full employment. Pakistan, a country at war with its neighbor 12 months ago, now hosting the world's most consequential peace talks. Not collapse, a deeper layer becoming visible. Second, the hidden substrate keeps mattering more than the visible structure. Gallium isn't in your phone because anyone designed it that way. It's there because physics required it, and one country controls it, and nobody built a serious alternative. Soil microbes were generating electrical current before we wired a building. The organic precursors of life were sitting in Martian rock for 3.5 billion years. Third, the internet keeps giving names to things that already existed. The 7749 meme didn't create synesthesia. It made a dispersed neurological trait legible enough for a community to recognize itself. That's the pattern underneath the pattern. Attention is its own kind of instrument. Most of what surfaced this week didn't become important this week. It was already there. Someone just looked at the right layer. Now let's wake up ready. Starting with the most consequential monetary policy transition in the United States in decades. Jerome Powell's chairmanship ends May 15th. Kevin Warsh, endorsed 13-11 by the Senate Banking Committee on April 29th, is expected to take the seat pending a full Senate vote that could happen any day this week. What to watch isn't the confirmation itself, it's Warsh's first public statement as chair. Warsh served on the Fed from 2006 to 2011, was known as a hawk relative to Bernanke, and has more recently aligned with positions favoring a stronger dollar and less activist monetary policy. The market has priced Powell continuity, measured by the 62% probability of one rate cut by September at current CME FedWatch levels. If Warsh's first remarks as chair signal even mild skepticism of that timeline, the short end of the yield curve reprices within hours. Dollar firms, long-duration growth names sell off, and the rate cut narrative that's been supporting equity multiples since March needs to be rebuilt from scratch.
One speech from one new official can undo months of forward guidance. The first thing Warsh says matters more than the confirmation vote itself.
Friday brings the April jobs report. BLS release at 8:30 a.m. March was strong, 178,000 non-farm payrolls, unemployment holding at 4.3%, with healthcare doing the heavy lifting following the resolution of a physician's strike. The April print matters for 2 reasons. First, the market is at the edge of distinguishing resilient labor from sticky labor. Resilient supports the soft landing. Sticky supports the hawks who voted against the easing bias last Wednesday. Second, don't just watch the headline number. Watch the healthcare subsector breakdown. March's gains included physicians' offices recovering from a strike. That's not a durable driver. If April healthcare normalizes down while the headline holds, the breadth of the recovery narrows, even as the aggregate looks fine. Market consensus is positioned around 150 to 165,000 for the headline. A print below 120,000 reprices small-cap consumer discretionary first. Those are the names with the most direct leverage to domestic spending confidence, and they're already stretched on the delinquency data.
The April jobs number drops Friday after everyone's already placed their bets on where the Fed goes next. Sequencing matters here. It's the last data point before Warsh's first week in office.
Earnings this week are meaningful. Monday, Palantir. Tuesday, AMD and HSBC. Wednesday, ARM Holdings and Disney. Palantir matters because its government contract language is the best leading indicator for federal AI spending available in public markets. The revenue number matters less than the call vocabulary. Words like deferring, restructuring, or evaluating scope in the government segment discussion would be the first public signal that DoD AI spending is being paused under the new budget framework. And that signal won't appear in any official document for months. AMD's guidance is the most direct read on AI chip demand outside NVIDIA, and it sets the interpretive context for Cerebrus's roadshow. Disney matters because streaming profitability has been the central thesis for traditional media's survival case. A beat accelerates consolidation. A miss reopens the question of whether the bundle model can hold through a sports rights renegotiation cycle.
Earnings season is nearly done. These three calls are the reads that set the narrative the next quarter trades on.
On IPOs, Cerebrus Systems is targeting a mid-May NASDAQ listing under the ticker CBRS, with the roadshow expected to begin this week. The S1, filed April 17th, shows $510 million in 2025 revenue, a $10+ billion OpenAI supply agreement in the pipeline, and a wafer-scale chip architecture that is physically 57 times larger than NVIDIA's H100. The most recent Bloomberg reporting suggests the company is targeting as much as $4 billion in the raise, at a valuation between $23 and $40 billion, depending on pricing. Watch where CBRS prices relative to its last private round. If it prices at the top of range, it validates institutional appetite for NVIDIA alternative architecture with credible revenue and clears the runway for the SpaceX S1, which is expected to go public later this month, ahead of a June roadshow targeting a $1.75 trillion valuation and a $75 billion raise. These two deals aren't independent events. CBRS is the stress test for everything that follows this summer.
The first credible AI chip challenger to test public markets is also setting the floor for the biggest IPO in history. They're in sequence, not isolation.
And the macro wildcard remains the Hormuz situation. The Islamabad talks failed April 12th. Trump canceled the U.S. envoy's Pakistan trip on April 25th. Iran's foreign minister flew to Moscow. There's no deal in sight. The market has absorbed $90 to $100 oil and adjusted shipping routes as operational reality. What it hasn't priced is duration, the scenario where this isn't resolved this spring. Every week the strait remains effectively blocked for significant LNG traffic is another week of energy inflation, baked deeper into supply chains and further away from negotiated resolution. Watch whether Iran's Moscow visit produces a new framework that Pakistan can bring back to Washington. If nothing concrete emerges by mid-May, the IMF's adverse scenario, 2.5% global growth, stops being a tail risk and starts being a base case. My personal watch for this week, Palantir's Monday call. And not for the earnings number, for the government segment language. Deferring versus expanding on federal AI contracts is the single most informative data point I can imagine in a week that includes a jobs report, a Fed transition, and a $4 billion IPO roadshow. It tells you whether the most commercially aggressive government AI customer is accelerating or pausing. And that answer matters far beyond Palantir's stock price.
And that is how you wake up ready. Most people treat slang like linguistic decay, shortcuts for people who can't be bothered with real words. But that misses what's actually going on underneath. It's time for a knowledge bomb. Slang isn't erosion, it's compression plus signaling. Start with compression. In any high-velocity environment, markets, trading floors, group chats, language gets optimized. You don't say, this asset is overvalued relative to its fundamentals and momentum is fading. You say it's cooked. Same payload, lower latency. Slang is what happens when meaning competes with time. But compression alone doesn't explain why slang persists. The second layer is signaling. Slang is a membership test. If you understand it, and more importantly, use it correctly, you're inside the network. If you don't, you're not. That's not accidental. Groups continuously regenerate slang because once a term becomes widely understood, it loses its edge as a filter. The signal decays. A new one emerges. Zoom out. Slang behaves like a market with three forces. Scarcity. New terms are valuable precisely because they're not widely understood. Adoption. As more people use a term, its utility increases, but its exclusivity drops. Arbitrage. Early adopters gain social leverage. Late adopters sound derivative. This is why slang cycles feel so fast right now. Platforms like TikTok and X have compressed the life cycle from niche to mainstream to obsolete. What used to take years now takes weeks. Here's the deeper implication. Slang is a leading indicator of cultural direction. It encodes what people value, mock, fear, or admire, often before formal language catches up. When a term spreads, it's not just a word moving, it's a worldview gaining ground. So the next time you hear a term you don't recognize, don't dismiss it. Ask, what is this compressing, and who is it trying to include or exclude? Because underneath the surface, it's not casual language. It's coordination, and that's the knowledge bomb.
Humor me. There's something suspicious about how many names we've invented for money. Like we're all trying to emotionally distance ourselves from it. Nobody says, I experienced a significant reduction in net worth. They say, yeah, my bread got absolutely cooked. Because we don't just have money. We have bread, dough, cheddar, stacks, bands, racks, paper, guap, Skrilla, loot, the bag. At some point, money stopped being a financial instrument and became a full grocery store. There are levels to it too. A little money, that's cash. A bit more, stacks. Doing well, bands. Really doing well, racks. And when you get to the very top, you stop naming it at all. You just say, we're good. That's when you know. When money goes silent. A billionaire doesn't say racks. They say, we're deploying capital. That's rich person slang. Same game, different vocabulary. And slang around money tells you your relationship to it. Bag means you're chasing it. Capital means you're allocating it. Liquidity event means you're explaining it to your accountant after it already happened. My favorite is secure the bag, because it sounds like a heist, but really it's just someone negotiating a slightly above market salary and updating their LinkedIn. But here's the thing. You can call it bread, dough, cheddar, or guap. It still disappears at the exact same speed. Rent doesn't care what you call it, neither does the IRS. Money has only one nickname for you, temporary holder.
There are debates that stop your scroll, and there are debates that clear the dinner table. It's time for the greater debate. The room is a debate hall that can't quite decide what it is. Half symposium, half sparring ring. Two podiums set at a slight angle, not parallel, not quite confrontational, but close enough that neither speaker can look away without making a choice. Behind the left podium, a whiteboard, something half erased. Looks like a demand curve. Looks like it lost the argument. The chairs in the front row are occupied by people who've read both books and still aren't sure. He doesn't wait for an introduction. Javier Milei steps forward. The hair is what you notice first, then the voice. The state is not your partner. It has never been your partner. Every peso, every dollar, every euro it has ever spent was taken. Not earned, not volunteered, not gifted. Taken. And we're standing here in 2026 discussing whether the entity that funds itself through coercion is secretly the engine of innovation. That's not economics. That's Stockholm Syndrome with a budget appendix. A few heads in the front row turn. Mariana Mazzucato walks to her podium. Unhurried, she opens a folder, doesn't look at it, closes it. The internet, GPS, touchscreens, the search algorithm, mRNA vaccine platforms. She pauses. Every single technology that makes your phone smart, that makes this debate possible, actually, was funded by governments before markets would touch it. Not because governments are clever, because markets are short-sighted. Private capital doesn't fund 15-year R&D cycles. It funds 4-year exit timelines. Those are not the same thing. Milei exhale. You're describing outcomes. I'm describing mechanisms. Yes, some government programs produced useful technology. Some Soviet collective farms produced wheat. The wheat doesn't vindicate collectivism. The iPhone doesn't vindicate the state. That lands. Mazzucato doesn't flinch. The surfer is brilliant. Steve Jobs was extraordinary. But you don't surf without an ocean. DARPA built the ocean. The National Institutes of Health built the ocean. The question isn't whether private entrepreneurs are valuable. Of course they are. The question is whether the ocean appeared on its own. You keep using the ocean, Milei says. Let me use a different one. You're describing a parasite that got lucky. A tick that landed on a horse that was already running and now claims credit for the speed. Now the room shifts. Mazzucato takes a beat. When she speaks, her voice is quieter. In the United States today, the public sector takes the biggest risks in technology development. It funds the failures that private capital won't touch. And when those bets pay off, the profits are entirely privatized. We socialize the risks. We privatize the rewards. That's not a market. That's a subsidy machine with a press release about free enterprise. And your solution? Milei leans forward. A government ownership stake in the companies it helped create? Let's think about who manages that fund. Politicians, bureaucrats, people whose incentive is not to find what works, it's to get reelected. You want to hand the least efficient allocators of capital in human history a share of the most successful companies on earth and call that justice. I want them compensated for the risk they took, Mazzucato says flatly. Not ownership, compensation. The way any early-stage investor who made a high-risk bet gets compensated. Any investor who made that bet used their own money. Taxpayers are investors. They just don't vote on the portfolio. Silence, not empty type. Millet steps back slightly. Hayek was right about one thing above everything else. No central planner can hold the dispersed knowledge of millions of individuals. Not because bureaucrats are evil, some are genuinely brilliant, but because the information doesn't exist in one place. It emerges from voluntary exchange. Price signals are the mechanism by which that knowledge is communicated and acted on. When the state intervenes, it doesn't just redirect resources. It destroys the information that tells us where resources should go. And yet, Mazzucato says, without the state setting a direction, a mission, markets don't solve climate change. They don't solve antibiotic resistance. They don't solve pandemic preparedness. These are coordination problems with 30-year time horizons and diffuse rewards. Markets don't price 30 years out. They price the next quarter. Then you don't have a market problem, Millet says. You have a time horizon problem, which means the solution is changing incentive structures for private actors, not substituting a public actor with worse incentives and no accountability. Accountability. She repeats it like a question. The financial sector in 2008 was entirely private. It created the largest economic disaster in 80 years and required a public bailout. Where was the market discipline? Where was the accountability? It was interrupted, Millet says, by the state. The room exhales. Neither has moved, neither has given ground. Here's what Millet was actually arguing, that freedom is not just an economic preference, but a moral precondition, that the state's coercive nature taints every outcome it produces, regardless of the result. His question isn't, does the market work better? It's by what right does anyone direct another person's resources? His fight isn't with efficiency, it's with legitimacy. Here's what Mazzucato was actually arguing, that we've built a fiction called the private sector that rests on a public foundation it refuses to acknowledge or compensate. Her question isn't, should government be bigger? It's who should share in the returns of collective risk. Her fight isn't with capitalism, it's with credit. They're not arguing about the same thing. Millet's question is moral. Mazzucato's is structural. A moral question and a structural question can coexist in the same space indefinitely without resolving, because resolving one doesn't touch the other. What it means practically, the next time someone tells you the market created something, ask who funded the basic research. And the next time someone tells you government built the future, ask who made it cheap enough to use. And that is the greater debate.
Let's invent again. James Edward Maso West was born on February 10, 1931, in Farmville, Virginia, in his grandfather's house because the local hospital wouldn't admit black patients. His mother was one of the human computers at Langley Research Center, the same women later made famous as the Hidden Figures. He grew up taking things apart, watches, radios, anything with moving parts, not to break them, but to understand what each piece was doing and why. By his early teens, he knew more about circuits than most of the adults around him. He went to Temple University for physics, summers at Bell Laboratories in Murray Hill, New Jersey, starting in 1953. Bell Labs was in most respects the intellectual center of the world at that moment, the place where the transistor was invented, where information theory was born. It was also a place where James West had to navigate a level of institutional exclusion that would have stopped most people. He didn't stop. In 1962, working with a German colleague named Gerhard Sessler, West invented the foil electret microphone. The mechanism is deceptively simple. A thin sheet of polymer film coated with metal on one side holds a permanent electrical charge. Sound waves hit the film, move it slightly, and that movement generates a signal. No power source required for the sensing element itself. No heavy casing, no complicated electronics. Just a charged polymer film doing what physics dictates. Here's the consequence nobody anticipated at the time. The electret microphone was so cheap, so small, and so reliable that it could go into everything. Today, 90% of the 2 billion microphones manufactured every year are electret microphones. The one in your phone, the one in your hearing aid, in your baby monitor, your laptop, your car's voice command, your earbuds. The one that captured this episode. Every human voice that's been recorded in the last 4 decades has almost certainly traveled through technology. James E. West invented in a lab in New Jersey in 1962. He filed over 250 patents. He co-founded the Association of Black Laboratory Employees at Bell Labs to create space for scientists who looked like him. He built the Corporate Research Fellowship Program that gave over 500 non-white graduate students a pathway into an industry he'd had to fight his way into. The man who built the hardware layer that every human voice now travels through did it in a country that spent the first decades of his life systematically preventing his voice from being heard. That's the invention. That's the inventor. And the gap between those two facts is worth sitting with for more than a moment. That's it for another episode of Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
We hope you enjoyed the arc. From molecules that waited 3 billion years on Mars to a room in Washington where the central bank fractured in a way it hasn't since 1992, to a language that turns money into a grocery store and a microphone invented by the man the world tried to keep silent. The pattern was simple: signal before noise. Because first principles are rarely flashy.
Subscribe, rate, and share this episode. It helps more than you think.
We do this for you, to help you have a better week, a sharper mind, and maybe even a longer attention span.
And a special thanks to our sponsor, agentweekly.ai.
Until next time, stay curious.
Stay kind.
And keep compounding.